Good evening and welcome. Tonight we are going to be going over the history and geography of Tonga. You can see here it says the Tonga Islands. There are three main island groups in Tonga. We have the Tongatapu group, the Ha'apai group, and the Vava'u group. And I have you zoomed out for two reasons. One of them is to see or to show you where Tonga is located exactly in the world. It is in the island chain belonging to Polynesia. You can see the northernmost point of New Zealand up here. There's Auckland. You can see some Australia over here. You can see Brisbane. And you can see some Papua New Guinea up here. The islands of Fiji are right here, and Samoa are right here, which I just did a video on. And their histories, Tonga and Samoa, meet quite a few places, so be sure to check that out if you haven't seen it already. I also want to show you this big trench right here. This is where two tectonic plates are meeting. The Pacific plate over here and the Australian plate is over here. And these plates are subducting, which means one is going underneath the other. So that creates a trench, and it also pushes this land up and creates the islands here. Let me show you a little bit more detail. And I'm going to take you over here so that you can see the islands. Let me just check. Wonderful. You can see. Alright, so here you can see the Tongatapu group. We have the largest island here of Tongatapu with the capital city right here, Nuku'alofa. You can also see the island of Eowa over here. It's a very lush, beautiful island. I mean, all the islands, of course, being in Polynesia are very, very beautiful, of course, having gorgeous beaches, palm trees, all the wonders of the tropics, but Eowa is considered the more like nature reserve of the islands, like a good place to go hiking. And it's the only place in Tonga where you can find like streams or little creeks. None of the islands of Tonga completely does not have any rivers. Over here we can see the Vava'u group, and you can really see the difference between the two types of islands here. We have volcanic islands and coral islands, things like atolls and reefs, things like that. Let me show you the ones over here in the Ha'apai group. Here we go. So you can really see lots of the little coral islands here. And, all the islands have lots of volcanic activity altogether. There are 16 volcanoes in the Tongan Islands. The last one to erupt was this one, Hunga Ha'apai. And the largest volcano and the highest point in Tonga is up here of Kau. It's just a big old pointy volcano. And you see this island here is also volcanic. You can kind of see there's a little dot of a lake there. And that's because it was once a big volcano like Kau over here. But it erupted and exploded its top off and collapsed within itself. So that's how we get a little lake that used to be the tip of a volcano. So those are the three big island groups in Tonga. Altogether, there are around 170 islands. Only 36 are inhabited, however. Let's take you back over to the Tongatapu group. I'll leave you there for the night so you can see the capital city. So like I said, it is a very volcanic area, which means we get eruptions and we also get earthquakes. Actually, the week that I'm filming this, they had a 6.4 here in Tongatapu. And it's also prone to cyclones because it's right along the equator. And, during cyclone season, they do get hit with tropical cyclones. So let's move on to its history because it's got the most amazing history, my goodness. Just like in my Samoa video, The islands were inhabited by the Lapita culture sometime around 1500 to 1000 BCE. Sorry for my squeaky chair. These people did not have a written writing system, I should say, like anything like that. They passed down their history and stories through words and stories and dances, things like that. But we don't have any written history of what happened on the islands during that time. We only know myths and stories, such as the myth of the god Tongaloa, who pulled the islands up from a fish hook when they got stuck on the bottom of the ocean, and he yanked them up, things like that. But what we do know is that in the 12th century, the king of these islands, the title of which is Tui Tonga, started to expand his territory across many of the islands of Polynesia. Some people consider it an empire, like the Tongan Empire, but we don't know if it was ran like a true empire, like if the islands were subjected to Tongan rule, to what extent they were. We don't know, but what we do know is that the first king to really push his influence around the islands was Tui Tonga Ahoetu, and the height of the Tongan Empire, so to say, like the Tongan sphere of influence in Polynesia, was with Tui Tonga Momo and Tui Tonga Tui Tatui. If you've seen my Samoa video, you know that the main royal family at this time was the Malietoas. In the 13th or 14th century, the Malietoa fought back against the Tui Tonga and managed to boot them out of Samoa. Not in like a really negative way. Historically, Tongans and Samoas get along splendidly. Many of the royal families marry into Samoan royal families, so on and so forth. They have a great relationship. But their defeat in Samoa led to a sort of downfall in the running of things in the royal family. It led to a few tyrannical rulers, many of which were assassinated, most notably in 1535 when Tui Tonga Takalawa was assassinated. His son, who would become Tui Tonga Kaulu Fonua, actually hunted down his father's assassins and killed them. But he also established a new dynasty to just, start fresh, keep things more modern, so to say, at that time. He created the Tui Ha'atakalawa dynasty, and he gave his brother a royal title of Tui Ha'atakalawa, named after his father. So the plan was that these two rules would split the duties of Tui Tonga, with the Tui Takalawa being more of the everyday, mundane kind of ruling aspects, while the Tui Tonga would be more of the spiritual, religious leader. And I should note that the royal family, even to this day, because it's never been broken, are the ancient descendants of Tongaloa, the king that rose the god that rose the islands from the sea. In 1610, the title of Tui Kanokupolu was created in order to divide up more of the responsibilities of the Tui Takalawa. And over time, the Tui Kanokupolu gained much more power and influence over the other leaders, and that lineage is the current royal family of Tonga today. They're considered Tui Kanokupolu. In 1616, we get our first European contact. It would have been with the Dutch. And some other notable people that landed in the Tongan Islands was Abel Tasman in 1643, and Captain James Cook came by 3 different times in the 1770s, made contact with them. And after his voyages, many different English missionaries came to the islands to preach Christianity. All sorts of different, I think the big one right now is the Methodist, but Protestants came, Catholics came, Lutherans from the German islands, things like that. But the Tongans really embraced Christianity and still do to this day. In 1799, the Tui Kanokupolu was murdered, and that sparked a huge civil war that was fought for a very long time. It ended in 1845 when one man managed to unite the islands together. His name was Taufa'ahau, and he was made the Tui Kanokupolu, and he was baptized officially as King George Tupou I. Interesting about his name, Tupou I, is that the royal family goes by the name Tupou, and the Roman numerals after that name doesn't really mean that like he was the first to be named George Tupou. It means he was the first of that lineage, that dynasty. So like his son had the second, the next ruler was the third. We'll get to them in a moment. It's a cool story. So on and so forth to the current, the king, the Tui Kanokupolu, would be Ahoe Tupou VI, the current ruler of Tonga. But the other big legacy that George Tupou I left was that he declared Tonga a constitutional monarchy in 1875. It still is to this day. And then on May 18th, 1900, they signed a treaty of friendship with Britain, and it became a British protected state. Let me zoom this over a little more so you can see more of Tonga. Is that better? Is it crooked? Maybe that's better. I hope so. Anyway, so British protected state. And if you've seen my Samoa video, there is a little bit of connected history there, because over in Samoa at this time, the Germans, the Americans, and the British were fighting over who would control what, and they had a big convention to figure out what to do. Part of the agreement was that Samoa would be divided between the Germans and the Americans, and for the British, they were allowed to deal with Tonga, and the Germans and Americans couldn't. That was part of the agreement, so that because the British didn't get any of the Samoas. And also the Tongans didn't want the Germans around there, since the Germans were snatching up a lot of islands in this area, so they allied more with the English. The whole concept of a British protected state meant that obviously Britain would protect them if they were ever attacked, and also that they would have a say over the finances of the islands, and that they could veto any kind of law that was trying to be passed. In 1918, the Tongan Islands were affected by the influenza pandemic. It killed 8% of the population. And it's during this time that I want to mention Queen Salote Tupou III, who I really admire. She's been the best part of researching about Tonga. She's a very beloved ruler. She has quite a lot in common with the English queens. For one thing, she attended the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II. She's the longest ruling monarch of Tonga for nearly 48 years, which is the title that Queen Elizabeth II currently has, the longest reigning monarch. She was crowned queen at age 18 after her father unexpectedly died, very much like Queen Victoria. She was also coronated. Her coronation was when she was 18. She was 6'3", unlike the queens in England. I don't actually know how tall they were, but I doubt they were 6'3". Very impressive woman. And what I think is really interesting is that she was born, and her mother passed not long after she was born. I think when she was 2 years old. So the aristocracy was pushing the king to produce a son, because in Tongan history there has never been a female ruler. So he did remarry, and they had 2 daughters. So they kind of had to give up and decide to make Salote Tupou III their queen, right? Which I think is really interesting. It's very much in common with Elizabeth I and to an extent Queen Victoria. Just a lot of really neat overlapping stories in terms of these queens. She was quite an impressive lady, but One of her biggest legacies is that she put the wheels in motion to end the Treaty of Friendship, which she wouldn't live to see, unfortunately. The treaty officially ended on June 4th, 1970, and Tongan became its own independent nation. A lot of news has happened recently. In the 21st century, there is more of a push for more democracy in the government. At that time, in like the early 2000s, the parliament had 9 seats and the people could only vote for 2, and the rest were appointed either by the king or they were positions that were inherited and like passed down through the generations. So, you know, it's the year 2000. They want to become more modern, more democratic. But at one point, on one of the newspapers, the Tongan Times was being very critical of the government because of this, and the government started to censor the magazine. And there was a lot of pushback against that because ever since George Tupou I declared it the constitutional monarchy, one of the big things he declared in that was that there would be freedom of the press, and there always had been until then. Even though there were many protests and things like that against that law, it was eventually passed in 2004. I'm thinking off the top of my head. I'm pretty sure it's 2004, 2003, 2004, around then. In 2006, the king unexpectedly passed. It was King Taufa Tupou IV. The new king was appointed. He was named George Tupou V. Like, they all have ceremonial titles once they're crowned, you know. So it was expected that the new king would modernize the election system, but it wasn't really. It was expanded to hold 30 seats, and the people could vote for 9, which wasn't much of an upgrade. And in November 16th of that year, there were big riots in Nuku'alofa. Buildings were burned, people lost their lives, a state of emergency was declared, things like that. So eventually in 2008, real political reforms were announced. The king gave a lot of his political power to the prime minister. And in 2010, when they elected their new parliament members, there were 26 seats then, and people were allowed to vote for 17, which was much more fair, so that people can elect representatives to represent them, basically. In 2014, that king unexpectedly passed, and that is when King Aho'etu Tupou VI was crowned king, and still is to this day. And that's basically where we are in the history of Tonga. The only real major news to happen recently in 2020, they were hit with a big cyclone in April, which, you know, April 2020 was not a good year for the world as it was, so it kind of left them in some dire straits, but they've basically recovered from that since. And yeah, that's basically where we are with Tonga today. So that's the end of my video for tonight. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you found this video relaxing and educational. In my next country, I have a lot of material to show you for that country. We'll see very soon. Thank you again, and have a very good